The drawer would not open. Myra Hale pressed her knee against the wood of the study desk and pulled again, harder this time, and somewhere above her a floorboard groaned under someone's weight. She froze. Her hand stayed locked around the brass handle, her heart beating so loudly she was sure it could be heard through the walls. Footsteps, slow ones, coming down the hallway toward the study door. She had exactly 10 seconds to decide whether to run or hide. She chose neither. She blew out the candle on the desk, dropped to the floor behind the heavy curtains, and held her breath until her lungs burned. The door opened. Light spilled in from the hallway lantern. A man's voice called out, low and unhurried, asking if anyone was there. Myra did not answer. She waited until the door closed again and the footsteps faded, and only then did she let herself breathe. This was not how she had imagined her first week working at Callaway Manor. But then again, nothing about the last 6 months of her life had gone the way she imagined it would. 6 months earlier, Myra had been sitting across from her mother at their kitchen table in a rented flat 2 towns away from the grand house she now cleaned for a living. Her mother had aged 10 years in the 2 years since Myra's father had died, and the letter in her hands was shaking as she read it out loud. It was the 4th letter from the bank that month. The family business that had once carried her father's name, Hale and Company, a shipping firm that had employed half the men in their town, no longer existed. It had been bought out, stripped down, and sold off in pieces almost a decade earlier, and yet the debts tied to Myra's father's name kept surfacing like something that refused to stay buried. Myra had asked one simple question that night. She wanted to know exactly what had happened to her father's company and exactly who had ended it. Nobody in her family would give her a straight answer. Her mother said it was old business, better left alone. Her uncle changed the subject every time she raised it. But Myra had found one name buried in an old newspaper clipping her father had kept folded inside his coat pocket until the day he died, Callaway. The same family whose manor sat on the hill above the river. The same family whose name appeared on half the buildings in the city now. So Myra did something her mother would never have approved of. She changed her surname on a housemaid application, wore her hair differently than she normally did, and took the only open position at Callaway Manor in the laundry and cleaning staff, working under the housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Mrs. Whitfield. She told herself it would only take a few weeks. Find the papers, find the truth, leave quietly. She had not counted on the son. Julian Callaway was not supposed to be home. The staff had whispered for days that the young master was traveling abroad for business and would not return until after the engagement dinner his father had been planning for over a year, an engagement to a woman from a respectable family, arranged the way these things were arranged among people with too much money and too little say over their own lives. Myra had heard the staff talk about the poor bride with something between pity and envy. Rich, yes. But trapped in a marriage she never chose, to a man she had never even met in person. Myra privately thought that sounded like the loneliest kind of wealth there was. She was thinking exactly that thought, mop in hand, when the study door opened again 3 nights after her failed search of the desk, and a man walked in who she was certain, for one confused second, must be a guest. He was tall in the way that made door frames look smaller, dressed like someone who had just come off a long journey and hadn't bothered to change, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his collar loose at the throat. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from travel, but the older kind, the kind that lives behind a person's eyes. He noticed her before she noticed him noticing. "You're new," he said. Myra straightened so fast the mop nearly clattered to the floor. "Yes, sir. I started a few weeks ago." "You don't have to call me sir." He said it like it embarrassed him a little. "Julian is fine." Myra knew exactly who he was. Everyone in the house knew exactly who he was. But something about the way he said his own name, plain and a little tired, like he was handing it to her as a small gift, made her decide not to correct the moment. "I'll try to remember that," she said, and went back to mopping, because it seemed safer than looking at him for too long. He didn't leave. He sat down at the edge of the desk, the same desk with the drawer that wouldn't open, and watched her work with the kind of quiet attention that made the back of her neck feel warm. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated only half a second. "Myra." "Just Myra." Just Myra. It wasn't entirely a lie. It also wasn't entirely the truth. She had learned there was a whole country of things a person could say that lived somewhere between those two places. He asked her nothing else that night, but he lingered in that study far longer than any man with somewhere else to be should have lingered. And when he finally left, he said good night to her the way a person says good night to someone they intend to see again. Myra told herself it meant nothing. She had a job to do, a father's name to clear, a mother waiting at home with unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen table. She did not have room in her life for the strange, steady way her chest had tightened when Julian Calloway said her name like it belonged to him already. She was wrong about the not meaning anything. She would learn exactly how wrong 2 weeks later, on the night the housekeeper handed her a folded card with the family crest pressed into the wax seal, listing the guests expected for the engagement dinner, and Myra's own name, her real one, the one she had buried the day she walked through the servants' entrance, sat printed at the very top of the list. Not as staff. As the bride. Her hands went cold before her mind caught up to what her eyes were reading. She read it 3 more times, certain the ink would rearrange itself into something that made sense, something that did not mean the family whose downfall she had come here to uncover was the very family her own mother had quietly promised her to. Months before Myra had ever heard the word Calloway spoken out loud in her own home. Mrs. Whitfield found her standing frozen in the hallway, the card still in her hand. "You've gone pale as a sheet, girl. What is it?" Myra folded the card before the housekeeper could see the name on it. "Nothing," she said. "Just tired." But it was not nothing. It was the exact opposite of nothing. It was the moment the ground under her carefully built plan cracked wide open, and somewhere far below, something much larger and much more dangerous was waiting to climb out. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling, running through every conversation she'd had with Julian since the study, replaying the sound of her own name in his mouth, and understanding with a slow and sinking certainty that the man she had been avoiding falling for was the very man her family had already promised her to. The engagement dinner was 6 days away, and she still had not found the papers that would tell her whether the man she couldn't stop thinking about was innocent of what his family had done to hers, or whether he had simply been too young, or too far away, to know the truth of what his own name had cost people like her. There was only one way to find out. She would have to go back into that study, drawer or no drawer, and this time she would not stop until she had her answer, even if the answer was one she could never take back once she knew it. She rose before dawn the next morning with a plan already forming, one that would take her deeper into the house than any housemaid was ever meant to go, and closer to Julian Calloway than any sensible woman with a secret like hers should have allowed herself to get. The morning after the guest list arrived, Myra moved through her chores like a woman underwater. Every sound in the house seemed louder than it should have been: the clink of silver in the dining room, the creak of the great staircase, the low murmur of the staff gossiping about the engagement dinner that was now less than a week away. She scrubbed the same section of floor twice without noticing, and Mrs. Whitfield finally sent her to air out the linens in the east wing just to get her out of the main house for an hour. It was there, hanging sheets in the cold morning air, that Julian found her again. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, leaning against the stone railing with his arms crossed, watching her the way he seemed to be making a habit of. "Very kind of you to say," Myra answered, not looking at him, focusing very hard on the clothesline in front of her. "I didn't mean it as an insult." His voice had dropped into something gentler. "I meant it as a question. Are you all right?" She almost laughed. Of everything she could have told him, that his family's name sat behind the collapse of her father's company, that she had broken into his father's study twice already, that the woman he was set to marry in a matter of days was standing 3 feet away from him, pretending to be someone else entirely. None of it could leave her mouth. So instead she said the only true thing she could afford to say. "I'm worried about my family, that's all." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "My father isn't an easy man to work for, or to be raised by, for that matter, if he said anything to frighten you." "He hasn't," Myra said quickly. And then, because she couldn't help herself, "Is that something staff usually need to be warned about?" Something in Julian's face shifted, closed off just slightly, the way a door closes when someone remembers there is a room behind it they'd rather not enter. "Let's just say my father believes the ends are more important than the means. He always has." Myra filed that sentence away and did not let herself react to it, though inside her chest something had gone very still and very cold. That night, once the house had gone dark and the last of the staff had gone to their rooms, Myra slipped back down the servants' stairwell toward the study for the third time. She had learned the patterns of the house well enough by now, which floorboard spoke and which stayed silent, which hallway the night guard walked and how long he lingered at each end before turning back. She reached the study door and found it, for once, unlocked. Inside, moonlight fell across the same stubborn desk. This time she didn't waste effort on the drawer. She had noticed, days earlier, a section of shelving behind the desk that didn't quite match the rest of the room, slightly newer wood, slightly different grain, built into the wall like something meant to be overlooked. She pressed against the edge of it and felt it give. Behind the shelf was a shallow compartment, and inside the compartment, a stack of yellowed papers tied with twine. Her hands trembled as she untied them. The first few pages meant little to her: old shipping contracts, names she didn't recognize, dates from years before her father's company had folded. But near the bottom of the stack she found it. A transfer agreement, dated 10 years earlier, signed at the bottom in 2 places. One signature belonged to Edmund Calloway. The other, smaller and more hesitant, clearly the handwriting of someone much younger, belonged to Julian. Myra sat back on her heels, staring at the paper until the ink blurred. He would have been barely 20 years old when this was signed, old enough to hold a pen, young enough to have no real understanding of what he was signing his name to. She did not know yet which one of those 2 facts mattered more. Somewhere above her, a door opened. She shoved the papers back into the compartment, but not fast enough. By the time she turned around, Julian was standing in the doorway of the study, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, something more careful, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person standing in front of him. "What are you doing in here?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand dressed politely, the way people who have been raised around money learn to demand things without raising their voice. Myra had no plan for this moment. She had rehearsed excuses for almost everything else, but not for this, not for Julian Calloway finding her on her knees in his father's study at midnight with his own signature clutched in her hand. "I can explain," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, she understood how hollow they sounded. "Then explain." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing every possible lie against the growing, terrible certainty that she did not want to lie to him anymore. But the truth was too large to hand him all at once. Not here, not with his father's house sleeping around them and the engagement dinner only days away. So she gave him the smallest piece of it she could bear to part with. "My father's company was destroyed 10 years ago," she said quietly. "A shipping firm, Hale and Company. I found papers with your family's name on them. I needed to know the truth." Julian's face went through several things at once: confusion, disbelief, and then, slowly, something that looked almost like recognition. as if a name from a long time ago had just resurfaced from somewhere deep and unwanted. "Hale," he repeated. "That name, I know that name." "You should," Myra said. "You signed it away." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Myra could hear her own pulse in her ears. Julian did not deny it. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there, staring at the compartment behind the desk as if it had betrayed him just as thoroughly as it had betrayed her. "I was 20 years old," he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "My father put a stack of papers in front of me the week I came back from university and told me it was time I started acting like his son instead of his guest. I signed whatever he told me to sign. I didn't read half of it. I didn't ask questions, because asking questions in that house has never gotten anyone anywhere good." "That's not an answer," Myra said. "That's an excuse." "I know," Julian said, and something in the honesty of it disarmed her more than any defense could have. "I know it is, but it's the only one I have." Myra stood up slowly, the papers still folded in her fist, and for the first time since she'd walked through the servants' entrance of Calloway Manor, she let herself say the rest of it out loud. "My name isn't Myra Hale," she said. "It's Myra Ellery, and in 6 days your father expects me to walk into that dining room and marry you." Julian went very still. She watched the words land on him one at a time, watched him work backward through every conversation they'd had in the last 3 weeks, the study, the linens, the strange easy warmth that had built up between them without either of them nomming it, and rearrange all of it around this one impossible fact. He started and stopped and started again. "You're the woman my father arranged for me to marry." "Yes." "And you took a position as a housemaid in my own house." "Yes." "Why?" Myra held up the papers still clenched in her hand. "Because I needed to know if the family I was about to marry into was the same family that destroyed mine, and now I know part of the answer. I don't know the rest of it yet." Julian looked at her for a long time, and something in his expression had changed completely from the man who had teased her in the study weeks earlier. This was a man staring down the shape of his entire life rearranging itself in front of him. His father, his name, the woman he had somehow, without meaning to, begun to care for long before he knew who she really was. "I need to see everything in that compartment," he said finally. "All of it, tonight." Myra hesitated only a moment before nodding, and together, in the moonlit quiet of a study that had kept its secrets far too long, they knelt on the floor and began to pull the rest of the papers free. Neither of them noticed the study door easing shut behind them, or the faint click of the lock turning from the outside. Neither of them heard the footsteps retreating down the hallway, unhurried, patient, the way a man walks when he already knows exactly how the rest of the story is going to go. Edmund Calloway had built his entire fortune on knowing things before other people knew he knew them, and tonight was no different. By the time Myra tried the study door an hour later and found it would not open, it was already too late to undo what had been set in motion. The compartment behind the desk sat empty of its most important documents, because Julian, thinking ahead in a way his younger self never had folded the transfer agreement and 2 other papers into the inside pocket of his jacket before they'd heard the lock turn. "He knows," Julian said quietly, staring at the door. "He's known I was in here. Maybe he's known about you from the very beginning." Myra felt the cold certainty of that settle into her stomach, like a stone dropped into still water. If Edmund Calloway had known who she really was all along, then nothing about the last 3 weeks, not the disguise, not the search, not even the quiet, growing thing that had built itself between her and Julian in stolen moments around the house, had been as private as she believed. Somewhere beyond that locked door, a much older and much more dangerous game had already been in motion long before Myra Hale ever picked up a mop and walked through the servants' entrance of Calloway Manor. and she was only now beginning to understand how many moves behind she truly was. For 3 days after the night in the study, Myra and Julian did not speak to each other. It wasn't a choice either of them made out loud. It simply happened, the way silence happens between two people who have said something to each other that neither of them knows how to follow up on. Myra threw herself back into her work, scrubbing floors that were already clean, folding linens that didn't need folding, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind away from the locked study door and the empty compartment behind the desk. Julian, for his part, seemed to be avoiding the main house altogether. The staff whispered that the young master had taken to riding out early each morning and returning only after dark, and Mrs. Whitfield remarked more than once that he looked like a man carrying something heavy he couldn't set down. Myra understood exactly what that felt like. On the fourth night, she found a note slipped under the door of the small room she shared with two other housemaids. It was written in a hand she now recognized without needing to be told whose it was. "Meet me at the old boathouse by the river. Midnight, come alone." She almost didn't go. Every instinct she had built over the last 3 weeks told her that walking alone to a boathouse at midnight to meet the son of the man she suspected of destroying her family was the single least sensible thing she could do. But she went anyway, because whatever else was true about the last month of her life, Julian Calloway had never once given her a reason to believe he meant her harm. He was waiting for her when she arrived, a lantern set on the old wooden dock beside him, its light throwing long shadows across the water. He looked different than she'd ever seen him, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hair pushed back like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "I've been going through everything," he said, before she'd even fully stepped onto the dock. "Every paper I could find without my father noticing. I think I understand most of it now." Myra sat down across from him on an overturned crate, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Tell me." Julian spread the papers between them, weighted down at the corners with river stones so the wind wouldn't take them. 10 years ago, my father needed capital to expand the shipping routes north. Your father's company controlled 3 of the ports he needed access to. Instead of negotiating a fair partnership, my father orchestrated a series of false claims against Hale and Company, bad debts that didn't exist, contracts that were quietly altered after they were signed. He used the courts to bankrupt your father slowly enough that it never looked deliberate from the outside. Myra's throat tightened. She had suspected something like this for months, ever since she found the newspaper clipping in her father's coat. But hearing it laid out plainly, in Julian's steady voice, in his own father's handwriting on the papers between them, made it real in a way suspicion never could. "And your signature," she said, "on the transfer agreement." He needed a second name on the final documents, someone from the family to make the paperwork look like a normal succession of business rather than what it actually was. Julian's jaw tightened. "He told me it was a formality. I believed him because I had no reason not to. I was 20. I trusted my own father." "You were old enough to ask questions." "I know." He didn't flinch from it. "I've had 3 days to sit with exactly how much I didn't ask, and none of it makes me feel any better about who I was at 20. Myra looked out at the dark water for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out over the trees, and the sound of it seemed to loosen something in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks. "My father lost everything," she said quietly. "The company, the house we grew up in, most of his health. In the end, the stress of it wore him down faster than any illness could have. He died still trying to understand what had gone wrong, still trying to find someone to blame who would actually answer for it." "I'm sorry," Julian said, and it was the plainest, least performed thing he had said to her since the night they met. "I know that doesn't undo any of it, but I am sorry, and I intend to do something about it, not just say the word and walk away feeling better." "What can you possibly do? He's your father. He controls everything, the money, the name, probably half the judges in this city by now." He controls the money, Julian agreed. He does not control me, not anymore. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out the folded transfer agreement, holding it up so the lantern light caught the old ink. This document proves fraud. Real, provable fraud with both our names on it. If I take it to the right people, the shipping board, the city magistrate, even the newspapers, if it comes to that, it destroys whatever reputation my father has left. It could destroy this family. It could destroy you too, Myra said. You signed it. I know that. His voice didn't waver. But I'd rather be the man who finally told the truth about what he signed than the man who spent the rest of his life protecting the lie. Myra studied him in the lantern light, searching his face for some sign that this was performance, some crack in the sincerity that would let her keep her guard up the way she'd promised herself she would. She didn't find one. What she found instead was a man who looked, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded, no title, no expectation, no engagement dinner looming over him like a debt come due. Just a person deciding in real time what kind of man he wanted to be. Something you should know, she said finally. About why I'm really here. I didn't just want proof for myself. My mother is still paying debts collectors claim are tied to my father's old company debts that don't make sense, that keep multiplying instead of shrinking. If your father orchestrated the original fraud, there's a chance he's still profiting from it now, 10 years later, through shell claims and false collectors. I think this is bigger than what happened a decade ago. I think it never stopped. Julian's expression darkened, but not toward her. That would explain a few things I found in his ledgers that never quite added up. Accounts under names I didn't recognize, small and steady, going back years. He looked up at her. If you're right, we're not just proving what happened 10 years ago. We're proving what's still happening now. For the first time since she had discovered the guest list with her own name printed at the top, Myra felt something other than fear settle into her chest. It was smaller than hope and more careful, but it was there, the sense that she was no longer facing this alone. The engagement dinner is in 3 days, she said. Your father expects a bride to walk into that room and smile for his guests while he announces our marriage like it's a business merger. What happens if I'm not there? What happens if you show up with proof of his fraud instead of a fiancé? Then he loses everything he spent this last decade building, Julian said. The reputation, the alliances, probably most of his money once the courts get involved, and he'll know exactly who to blame for it. He'll come after my family, Myra said. He'll come after yours too. Let him try. There was something new in Julian's voice now, something steadier than the tired, uncertain man she'd first met in the study. I've spent my whole life doing what that man told me to do because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I'm done being afraid of him. Myra wanted to believe it would be that simple. Years of watching her own family crumble under quiet, patient cruelty had taught her that men like Edmund Calloway rarely lost gracefully, and never lost without inflicting as much damage as possible on their way down. But sitting there in the lantern light, watching Julian gather the papers back into a careful stack, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that this time might be different. They agreed on a plan before they left the boathouse that night. Julian would make copies of the most damning documents and hide them somewhere his father would never think to look, not in the manor at all. But with a lawyer in the city Julian trusted from his university days, a man with no ties to the Calloway name and no reason to protect it, Myra would continue her work in the house as though nothing had changed, watching for any sign that Edmund suspected more than he was letting on. And on the night of the engagement dinner, instead of walking into that room as a frightened bride playing a part, she would walk in with the truth already sitting in the hands of people who could not be bought or silenced. It was a good plan. It was also, as most good plans are, built on the assumption that Edmund Calloway did not already know far more than either of them realized. He did. 2 nights before the engagement dinner, Myra was summoned to Edmund's private study, not the one behind the desk with the hidden compartment, but a smaller, colder room on the 3rd floor that the staff rarely entered. Mrs. Whitfield delivered the message with a strange, careful look on her face. The kind of look a person gives when they suspect something is wrong but have decided it isn't their business to ask. Edmund was seated behind his desk when Myra entered, a glass of dark liquor untouched in front of him, his expression unreadable in the low lamplight. He did not stand. He did not offer her a seat. He simply watched her cross the room with the same patient, calculating attention Myra imagined he must have given every business deal he'd ever orchestrated. "Miss Ellery," he said, and the sound of her real name in his mouth landed like a slap. Myra kept her spine straight and her hands still at her sides, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. "Sir." "I've known who you were since your third day in this house," Edmund said, swirling the liquor in his glass without drinking it. "Your mother wrote to me herself some months ago, begging for leniency on debts I'm told your family can no longer afford. She mentioned in that letter that her daughter had gone missing from the house shortly after run off, she assumed, out of shame over the engagement. It didn't take much effort to connect the dates." Myra said nothing. Her mind raced through every possible response and discarded each one before it reached her mouth. "I let you stay," Edmund continued, "because I was curious what a woman desperate enough to disguise herself as a housemaid in my own home might actually be looking for, and because, I'll admit, it amused me to watch my son fall for a woman he didn't realize was already promised to him." He finally looked up and his eyes were as cold as Myra had imagined they would be. "It seems the two of you have been busy these last few nights. My study, the boathouse." A great deal of very serious conversation for two people who are supposed to be strangers. "You've had us followed," Myra said quietly. "I protect what's mine," Edmund said. "That includes information, Miss Ellery, especially information." Myra felt the floor tilt beneath her, the careful plan she and Julian had built over the last 3 nights suddenly feeling as fragile as it truly was. "Then you know what's in those papers." "I know everything that's in those papers. I wrote most of them myself." Edmund set his glass down without ever having taken a sip. "What you and my son seem to have failed to consider is that documents mean very little without someone willing to act on them. The magistrate you're so fond of imagining owes me a debt that will outlast both of us. The lawyer my son thinks he can trust has a brother whose business depends entirely on contracts my company controls. And the newspapers, well, newspapers require advertisers, Miss Ellery, and advertisers require goodwill. And goodwill is a resource I have spent 30 years accumulating. So you're telling me there's no one who can touch you?" "I'm telling you," Edmund said, leaning forward slightly, "that you should think very carefully about what happens to your mother's remaining assets, and to whatever is left of your father's name, if you continue trying to unravel a decade of very carefully arranged business. I am not an unreasonable man. Marry my son. Say nothing further about what you found, and I will personally see to it that every remaining debt tied to your family disappears within the week." Myra stood very still, her mind working faster than it ever had in her life. It would have been easy in that moment to believe him, to believe that silence was the only sensible choice left to her, that fighting a man with 30 years of carefully bought loyalty was a battle she could not possibly win. Part of her, the tired, frightened part that had watched her mother cry over unpaid bills for 2 years straight, wanted very badly to say yes. But she thought of her father, folding that newspaper clipping into his coat pocket every single day until the day he died, still trying to understand what had happened to him. She thought of Julian in the lantern light at the boathouse, saying I'd rather be the man who finally told the truth. And she thought of every housemaid, every clerk, every small business owner in this city who might have been quietly ruined by the same patient, careful cruelty sitting across from her right now, sipping liquor he hadn't touched, certain of his own victory before she'd even had the chance to answer. "No," Myra said. Edmund's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "I beg your pardon." "I said no. I won't marry your son to buy my family's silence, and I won't stop looking into what you did to my father's company or to whoever else you've quietly ruined since then." Her voice did not shake. She was surprised by that later, when she had time to think back on it. In the moment, it simply came out steady, certain, like something that had been building inside her for 2 years and had finally found the door. "You can threaten my mother's assets all you like. There won't be much left to threaten once the truth is out. Either way, better she loses it knowing exactly who took it from her than keep living under the polite fiction that it was simply bad luck." For a long moment, Edmund said nothing at all. Then slowly he smiled, not a warm smile, but something colder, more dangerous, the smile of a man recalculating his approach rather than admitting defeat. "You have your father's stubbornness," he said. "It's a pity it did him so little good." "We'll see," Myra said, and turned to leave the room before her legs could betray how badly they were shaking. She made it as far as the third-floor landing before she had to stop and lean against the wall, her breath coming fast and uneven, the full weight of what she had just done settling over her like cold water. She had refused Edmund Calloway to his face. She had, in doing so, likely destroyed any chance of a quiet resolution to this. No more careful copying of documents, no more waiting for the right moment. Whatever happened now would happen fast, and it would happen in front of everyone. She needed to find Julian, tonight. She found him in the stable, of all places, saddling a horse in the dark with the same restless, unfinished energy he'd carried since the night at the boathouse. He looked up when she came through the door, and whatever he saw on her face made him drop the saddle strap immediately and cross the space between them. "What happened?" "Your father knows everything," Myra said. "He's known since before I even started working here. He had us followed. He knows about the study, the boathouse, all of it." She forced herself to keep her voice level even as her hands trembled at her sides. "He offered to erase my family's debts if I married you and said nothing more about the papers." Julian went very still. "And you said?" "I said no." Something moved across his face that Myra couldn't quite name, surprise, maybe, or something closer to relief, or perhaps both at once. "He'll move against us now, faster than we planned for." "I know. The lawyer I trusted. My father implied he already has leverage over him." "He did." Julian ran a hand through his hair, thinking fast, the careful, unhurried man from the boathouse replaced now by someone sharper, more urgent. "Then we don't wait for the engagement dinner. We move tonight. There's a journalist in the city, a woman my mother knew before she passed, who spent years trying to expose corruption among families like mine and never had the documents to prove it. If we get her the papers before my father has time to bury them." "Your father just told me the newspapers depend on his goodwill." "Not all of them," Julian said. "Not the small ones, not the ones with nothing left to lose." He was already moving, pulling the saddle back onto the horse with quick, sure hands. "It's a 2-hour ride into the city. If we leave now, we can reach her before dawn." Myra looked at the horse and then at Julian and felt the full, dizzying reality of what they were about to do settle over her, riding out in the dark with the one piece of proof that could either save her family's name or destroy them both trying. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly, "your father will make sure neither of us has anywhere left to go." "If we do nothing," Julian said, "he already has." Myra held his gaze for one long moment, and then nodded, and let him help her up onto the horse behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist as he turned them toward the dark road leading away from Calloway Manor and everything it represented. Behind them, high in a third-floor window, a lamp still burned in Edmund Calloway's study, and if either of them had looked back, they might have seen the shape of him standing at the glass, watching them ride away with the same patient, unbothered calm of a man who had already planned for exactly this. The journalist's name was Odette Marsh, and she opened her door at 4 in the morning with a pistol in one hand and a look on her face that suggested she had been expecting trouble for most of her adult life. She lowered the pistol the moment Julian said his own name, not out of respect for it, but recognition. The particular, weary recognition of someone who has spent years collecting rumors about a family and finally sees proof of them standing on her doorstep. "Calloway," she said, "I've been waiting a long time for one of you to show up here instead of the other way around." She let them in, listened to the whole story without interrupting once, and spread the documents across her kitchen table with the careful, practiced hands of someone who had handled far more dangerous papers than these. By the time the sun came up over the rooftops outside her window, she had already begun drafting the first lines of a story that would take the rest of that week to finish, cross-checking every claim, every name, every date against records she had been quietly gathering for years on her own. "This will take time," she warned them. "Days, maybe longer, to verify everything properly and get it into print before your father's lawyers can bury it in an injunction. You should both prepare for him to come at you hard in the meantime." She was right. By the time Myra and Julian returned to Calloway Manor 2 hours later, exhausted and windburned from the ride, the household was already in an uproar. Mrs. Whitfield met them at the servants' entrance with a face gone pale and tight, informing Myra in a low, urgent voice that Edmund had dismissed her from her position an hour earlier and instructed the staff that she was no longer permitted anywhere on the grounds. Julian did not wait to hear the rest of it. He walked straight through the main hall and up the grand staircase toward his father's study, Myra following close behind despite Mrs. Whitfield's frantic whispers that she should not go in there, that the master was in a temper unlike anything the staff had seen in years. Edmund was waiting for them, exactly as Myra suspected he would be, standing at the window of his study with his hands folded behind his back, looking out over the grounds like a man surveying a kingdom rather than a household in crisis. "I assume you've done something irreversible," he said without turning around. "We gave everything to a journalist in the city," Julian said. "The transfer agreement, the ledgers with the shell accounts, all of it. It'll be in print by the end of the week." Edmund turned then, and for the first time since Myra had met him, something like genuine anger flickered across his face before he smoothed it back into that same cold, controlled calm. "You understand what you've done. Not just to me. To this family's name, to every contract that still bears the Calloway seal, to your own future standing in this city." "I understand exactly what I've done," Julian said. "I've spent my entire life understanding what it means to be your son. I'm finally done letting that be the only thing that matters." "And you," Edmund's gaze shifted to Myra, sharp and unforgiving. "I offered you a way out, a clean one. Your family's debts erased, your name protected, a quiet life you could have built for yourself here. You chose this instead." "I chose the truth," Myra said. "My father spent the last 2 years of his life trying to understand what happened to him and dying without ever getting an answer. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life the same way, wondering, staying quiet, letting you buy my silence the way you bought everyone else's." Edmund studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from anger into something colder, more calculating. "Then you should both know that the moment this story runs, I will contest every claim in it through every legal avenue available to me. I will drag this out for years if I have to. Your mother's remaining assets, Miss Ellery, will be the first thing seized the moment my lawyers file suit against you both for defamation and theft of private documents." "You can try," Julian said, "but you'll be doing it in public now, in front of every judge, every business partner, every member of this city who spent years wondering exactly how a man with your history built the fortune he did. That's the part you haven't accounted for. You've never had to defend yourself in the light before. You've always operated in rooms like this one, behind closed doors, with people too afraid or too indebted to say no to you. That's about to change." For the first time, Edmund Calloway did not have an immediate answer. The silence stretched long enough that Myra found herself holding her breath, watching the man who had controlled every outcome in this house, for as long as anyone could remember, search for a response that simply was not there. Whatever he said next, they both understood, would not be the calm, controlled certainty he'd walked into every previous conversation with. He was, for the first time in this entire ordeal, genuinely uncertain of what came next. "Get out of my house," he said finally, quiet and cold. "Both of you." Julian did not move. "This is my house too, Father. Has been since the day I was born. You don't get to decide anymore who belongs in it and who doesn't." Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He simply turned back to the window, his back rigid, his silence more damning than any argument he could have made. And Myra understood, watching him, that whatever power he still believed he held over this house, over his son, over her family's future, had already begun slipping through his fingers the moment they walked through Odette Marsh's front door before dawn that morning. They left the study together, and neither of them looked back. The story ran 9 days later, spread across 3 columns of the city's smallest but most fearless newspaper, under a headline that named the Calloway family plainly and without apology. Myra read it standing in her mother's kitchen, the same table where 2 years earlier her mother had read out the first of those terrible bank letters with shaking hands. This time, it was Myra's hands that shook, though for entirely different reasons. The days that followed moved faster than Myra could fully absorb. Odette Marsh's story caught the attention of 2 larger papers within the week, papers with far less patience for protecting old money and far more interest in a scandal that sold copies. Other families who had done business with Edmund Calloway over the years began quietly coming forward, some through lawyers, some through anonymous letters to the editor, each one adding another thread to a pattern that had clearly been building for far longer than anyone outside the family had ever suspected. The magistrate Edmund had been counting on recused himself from any related proceedings within days. Once it became clear the public was watching closely enough that quiet favors were no longer quiet. The lawyer Julian had once trusted, freed suddenly from whatever leverage Edmund held over his brother's business, came forward with additional records he had been sitting on for years, too frightened to use them until now. It was not a clean victory. Myra had known from the boathouse that it never would be. Edmund fought exactly as hard as he had promised he would, dragging both Julian and Myra through months of legal proceedings, freezing what remained of the family accounts, forcing Julian to testify against his own father in a courtroom filled with reporters who had spent years waiting for exactly this story. There were nights during those months when Myra wondered if any of it had been worth it, watching Julian come home from another long day of depositions looking more hollowed out than she'd ever seen him. But there were other nights too, nights when her mother called to tell her, voice trembling with something other than fear for the first time in years, that a collections agency had finally, formally, dropped its claim against them, the debt revealed for the manufactured fraud it had always been. Nights when letters arrived from other families her father had once known, thanking her, cautiously, for finally saying out loud what so many of them had quietly suspected for a decade. It took the better part of a year for the case to fully resolve. Edmund Calloway was never sent to prison. Men with his resources rarely are, Myra learned, no matter how thoroughly their crimes are proven, but he lost nearly everything else. His name, once synonymous with respectability in the city, became a byword for exactly the opposite. His business partners scattered. His remaining fortune was reduced by settlements to a fraction of what it had once been. He retreated to a smaller property outside the city and was rarely spoken of again, except in the past tense, the way people speak about a storm that has finally passed. Julian inherited what remained of the family name, and chose, in the months that followed, to rebuild it into something almost unrecognizable from what his father had made of it, donating a significant portion of the settlement funds to the very families his father had once ruined, including, though Myra had never asked him to, a full restoration of what remained of her father's original shipping contracts, reissued under her own name. It was on a quiet afternoon, nearly 14 months after that first night in the study, with the drawer that would not open, that Julian found Myra standing at the edge of the old dock by the river, not far from the boathouse where they had first spread those papers out under lantern light, and decided together to risk everything they had. "You know," he said, coming to stand beside her, "you never actually agreed to marry me." Myra laughed, the sound surprising her with how easily it came now after everything. "You never actually asked. Your father arranged it for you, if you'll recall. I believe I was quite clear about how I felt regarding arrangements made on my behalf." "Fair point." Julian turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her chest go warm and still all at once, the same way it had that very first night in the study when he'd told her she didn't have to call him sir. "Myra Ellery, would you do me the very great honor of marrying me, not because our families arranged it, not to fix anything or prove anything or settle any old debt, just because I have spent the last 14 months absolutely certain that I don't want to build whatever comes next without you standing beside me?" Myra looked out at the water for a long moment, remembering the frightened, disguised woman who had first walked through the servants' entrance of Callaway Manor with nothing but a false name and a desperate need for answers. She thought of her father, and the newspaper clipping he had carried until the day he died, never knowing that the truth would eventually come out after all. She thought of every quiet, careful choice that had led her from that kitchen table with her mother's shaking hands to this exact dock, this exact moment, this exact man asking her a question he clearly already knew the answer to. "Yes," she said, "I would." They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony by the same river, with none of the grandeur Edmund Callaway had once planned for an engagement built on secrets and silence. Myra's mother stood at the front with tears in her eyes that had nothing to do with unpaid bills or bank letters for the first time in years. Odette Marsh attended too, sitting near the back with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had helped bring down exactly the kind of man she had spent her whole career chasing. Myra thought sometimes about that first frightened week in the manor, hiding behind curtains, holding her breath, certain that discovery meant disaster. She had been right about that in a way. Discovery had meant disaster for a house built on lies that had stood far too long. But it had also meant something she never could have predicted from behind those curtains, heart-pounding, praying not to be found. It had meant, in the end, the truth. And beyond the truth, somehow, against every reasonable expectation she had walked into that house with, it had meant love too, built not on arrangement or convenience but on two people choosing, again and again, in the hardest possible circumstances, to stand beside each other instead of walking away. She arrived at Callaway Manor as a housemaid, hiding behind a name that was not her own, searching for a truth she was terrified to find. She left it as herself, in full, for the first time in years, having found far more than she had ever gone looking for.